Welcome, friends, to a tale of second chances and unexpected love that proves it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Enjoy the story. The 50th floor of the gleaming Prescott Tower was eerily quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of Patricia Hawthorne's Louboutin heels as she made her way down the marble-floored hallway towards the corner office of Brandon Prescott, CEO of Prescott Industries, and one of New York's most eligible bachelors. Patricia hesitated at the imposing oak door, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. In her 15 years as Brandon's personal assistant, she'd delivered all manner of news to her boss, from billion-dollar mergers to scandalous tabloid exposés. But this was different. She knocked softly and entered without waiting for a response. Brandon was where he always was at this hour, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that only seemed to enhance his rugged good looks. "Mr. Prescott," Patricia began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm afraid I have some news." Brandon didn't turn around. "Unless it's about the Jensen deal, I'm not interested, Patricia." Patricia took a deep breath. "It's about Claire, sir, your ex-wife." At this, Brandon's shoulders tensed visibly. He turned slowly, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. "Claire? What could she possibly want after all these years?" "She's dead, sir." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and oppressive. For a moment, Brandon's carefully cultivated mask of indifference slipped, revealing a mix of shock, pain, and something else. Guilt, perhaps? But as quickly as it appeared, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by his usual stoic expression. "I see," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And why exactly are you telling me this, Patricia?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, as her legal husband, you're responsible for the funeral arrangements. Her family is asking—" "Family?" Brandon scoffed. "What family? Claire was an orphan, or have you forgotten? I meant her neighbors, sir, the people she's been living with. They can't afford—" Brandon waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, handle it. Use the company account if you must. Just keep it quiet, understand? The last thing I need is the press getting wind of this." Patricia nodded, relieved that he wasn't putting up more of a fight. But as she turned to leave, Brandon's voice stopped her. "And Patricia, I won't be attending." She turned back, surprised. "Sir, I really think you should consider—" "I said no," Brandon snapped, his tone brooking no argument. "That chapter of my life is closed, has been for years." As Patricia left the office, closing the door softly behind her, Brandon turned back to the window. But instead of the glittering cityscape, all he could see was Claire's face. Young, beautiful, full of life and love. The face he'd last seen 7 years ago, streaked with tears as she begged him to listen, to understand. He shook his head violently, banishing the memory. It was ancient history. Claire had made her choice, and he'd made his. End of story. But as he returned to his desk, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over, that somehow, some way, Claire was about to upend his carefully ordered world one last time. That night, as Brandon nursed a glass of scotch in his penthouse apartment, the memories he'd spent years suppressing came flooding back. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 10 years old again, cowering in the dark closet as his mother's drunken shouts echoed through their dingy apartment. "You worthless little brat!" she'd scream, pounding on the closet door. "Just like your father! Always hiding, always weak!" Brandon shuddered, downing the rest of his scotch in one burning gulp. He'd sworn he'd never be weak again, never let anyone have that kind of power over him. And for years, he'd succeeded. He'd clawed his way out of poverty, built an empire with nothing but his wits and ruthless determination. He'd become everything his mother said he'd never be. But then came Claire. He'd met her at a charity gala, one of those tedious events he was obligated to attend as New York's rising business star. She'd been working as a waitress, putting herself through art school. Brandon had been captivated by her warmth, her genuine smile in a room full of plastic socialites. Against his better judgment, he'd asked her out. And to his surprise, she'd said yes. Their whirlwind romance had been the talk of the town, the hard-nosed tycoon and the free-spirited artist, an unlikely pair that somehow just worked. For the first time in his life, Brandon had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to trust someone completely. They'd married after just 6 months, much to the shock of New York's elite, but Brandon hadn't cared what anyone thought. He was happy, truly happy, for the first time in his life. There was just one condition to their marriage, one line he refused to cross: no children. "I can't risk it, Claire," he'd told her the night before their wedding. "I can't risk becoming like her." Claire had been disappointed, he knew, but she'd agreed. "It's okay, Brandon," she'd said, cupping his face in her hands. "You're enough for me. You'll always be enough." For 5 years, they'd been blissfully happy, or so Brandon had thought. But then came that fateful night, the night that had shattered everything. "Brandon, I'm pregnant," Claire had said, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and apprehension. In that moment, all Brandon could hear was his mother's voice, screaming about what a disappointment he was, how he'd ruined her life just by existing. All he could feel was blind, irrational panic. "How could you do this to me?" he'd shouted, his voice strangled with fury and fear. "We had an agreement, Claire." "Brandon, please," Claire had begged, reaching for him. "This is a miracle, our miracle. I know you're scared, but—" "Scared?" He'd laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "I'm not scared, Claire. I'm furious. How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been trying to trap me like this?" Claire had recoiled as if he'd slapped her. "Trap you? Brandon, what are you talking about? This is our child." But Brandon was beyond reason. All he could see was betrayal. All he could feel was the suffocating fear of becoming the very thing he'd spent his life running from. "Get out," he'd snarled. "Get out of my house, get out of my life, we're done." The next morning, Claire was gone. All that remained was a note on the kitchen counter. "When you're ready to be the man I know you can be, you'll know where to find me." But Brandon had never looked for her. He'd thrown himself into his work, building Prescott Industries into the juggernaut it was today. He'd dated casually, never allowing anyone to get close again. He'd convinced himself he was better off alone. And now Claire was gone for good, and Brandon was left with nothing but regret and a gnawing emptiness he couldn't seem to fill. As the first light of dawn crept into his apartment, Brandon made a decision. He'd go to the funeral. Not for Claire, he told himself, but for closure. To finally put this chapter of his life to rest once and for all. Little did he know, fate had other plans entirely. The day of Claire's funeral dawned gray and dreary, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. Brandon stood at the edge of the small gathering in the cemetery, feeling distinctly out of place in his tailored Armani suit. The turnout was smaller than he'd expected. A handful of people, mostly older women who looked like they'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, huddled together near the simple casket. There were no flowers, no fancy headstone, just a plain wooden box about to be lowered into the unforgiving earth. Brandon felt a twinge of something. Guilt? Regret? He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the curious glances being thrown his way. He could practically hear the whispers. "Isn't that Brandon Prescott? What's he doing here?" Patricia materialized at his elbow, as always anticipating his needs before he could voice them. "Everything's been arranged, sir," she murmured. "We can leave whenever you're ready." Brandon nodded, already turning to go. He'd made an appearance, paid his respects, such as they were. It was time to get back to the real world, to board meetings and billion-dollar deals and— "Excuse me, are you Brandon?" The quavering voice stopped him in his tracks. He turned to see an elderly woman peering up at him through thick glasses, her wrinkled face a map of sorrow and— Was that accusation? "Yes," he replied stiffly. "And you are?" "Margaret," the old woman said. "I was Claire's neighbor. She lived with me these past few years." Brandon felt a flicker of surprise. Claire, his free-spirited, vibrant Claire, living with this ancient relic? But before he could respond, Margaret continued. "There's someone you need to meet," she said, her voice taking on a steely quality that belied her fragile appearance. She turned, beckoning to someone behind her. "Sophie, come here, dear." And that's when Brandon's world tilted on its axis. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, stepped out from behind Margaret. She had Claire's golden curls, her delicate features, but her eyes were all Brandon's. Steel gray and serious, they regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Sophie," Margaret said gently, "this is your father." The words hit Brandon like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mind reeling. A daughter? He had a daughter? That's impossible, he stammered. There must be some mistake. But even as he said it, he knew it was true. Looking at Sophie was like looking in a mirror, albeit a much younger, feminine version. This was his child. The child he'd accused Claire of using to trap him. The child he'd run from before it was even born. Sophie regarded him solemnly, her little face a mask of adult composure that broke Brandon's heart. "Hello," she said quietly. "Mom told me about you." She did?" Brandon managed, his throat tight. Sophie nodded. "She said you were a good man who was very scared. She said you'd come find us when you were ready." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "But you never did." The accusation in those words, so softly spoken, cut Brandon to the quick. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say to justify 7 years of absence? Margaret stepped in, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Prescott, I know this is a shock, but Claire's gone now, and Sophie needs her father." Brandon looked from Margaret to Sophie, then to Patricia, who stood nearby with an expression of utter shock on her usually composed face. Finally, his eyes landed on Claire's casket, still waiting to be lowered into the ground. In that moment, Brandon Prescott, titan of industry and self-made billionaire, did something he hadn't done since he was a small boy hiding from his mother's rage. He ran. Brandon's sleek Aston Martin screeched to a halt in front of Prescott Tower, drawing curious glances from passers-by. He barely noticed, his mind still reeling from the bombshell dropped on him at the cemetery. A daughter. He had a daughter. As he strode through the lobby, employees scattered out of his way, sensing the thundercloud of emotions radiating off their usually stoic CEO. He jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, as if sheer force could make it arrive faster. "Brandon, wait up!" He turned to see Eddie Reeves, his oldest friend and the company's CFO, jogging towards him. Under normal circumstances, Eddie was the one person Brandon might have confided in, but today all he wanted was to be alone with his tumultuous thoughts. "Not now, Eddie," he growled as the elevator doors finally opened. But Eddie, never one to be deterred, slipped in just as the doors were closing. "Come on, man, talk to me. You look like you've seen a ghost." Brandon let out a harsh laugh. "A ghost? Try a whole damn skeleton freshly tumbled out of the closet." Eddie's brow furrowed in concern. "What are you talking about? Does this have to do with Claire's funeral?" At the mention of Claire's name, something inside Brandon snapped. He whirled on Eddie, his eyes blazing. "Did you know?" he demanded. "Did you know about the child?" Eddie's face paled. "Child? What Oh, no." "Oh, yes," Brandon snarled. "Turns out those fertility suppressants you gave me were about as effective as sugar pills. Care to explain that, old friend?" The elevator dinged, opening onto the executive floor. Brandon stormed out, Eddie hot on his heels. "Brandon, wait!" Eddie pleaded as they entered Brandon's office. "You don't understand." "Then enlighten me," Brandon roared, rounding on his friend. "Explain to me how I just met a 6-year-old girl with my eyes and Claire's smile. Explain to me how I've spent 7 years believing my wife betrayed me, only to find out the betrayal was all mine." Eddie held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Brandon, I swear, I had no idea Claire was pregnant. But the pills. What about them?" Brandon's voice was dangerously low. Eddie swallowed hard. "They were placebos, Brandon. Vitamins. I couldn't in good conscience give you actual fertility suppressants. It seemed insane, and I thought you'd come to your senses eventually." The silence that followed was deafening. Brandon stared at Eddie, his oldest friend, the man who'd stood by him through every up and down of his tumultuous life, and in that moment, he hated him more than he'd ever hated anyone. "Get out," he said, his voice a deadly whisper. "Brandon, please." "Get out!" Brandon bellowed, sweeping his arm across his desk and sending papers and a crystal decanter crashing to the floor. Eddie backed away, his face a mask of regret and fear. "I'm sorry, Brandon. I truly am. I was just trying to help." As the door closed behind Eddie, Brandon slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. The anger drained out of him, leaving nothing but a bone-deep weariness and an overwhelming sense of guilt. He'd been wrong, so terribly, catastrophically wrong. Claire hadn't betrayed him. He'd betrayed her. He'd abandoned her when she needed him most, left her to face pregnancy and motherhood alone, all because of his own irrational fears and a misplaced sense of betrayal. And now Claire was gone. And he was left with a daughter he didn't know, a child who'd grown up without him because of his own stubborn pride and fear. The intercom on his desk buzzed, startling him out of his spiral of self-recrimination. "Mr. Prescott?" Patricia's voice was hesitant, unsure. "I have Margaret on the line, the woman from the funeral. She says it's about Sophie." Brandon's heart leapt into his throat. Sophie, his daughter. The thought still felt foreign, terrifying. "Put her through," he said, his voice hoarse. There was a click, and then Margaret's tremulous voice filled the room. "Mr. Prescott, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call. It's Sophie. She's gone missing." Brandon's world narrowed to a pinpoint of panic. "Missing? What do you mean, missing?" Margaret's voice was thick with tears. "After you left the cemetery, she just ran off. I've looked everywhere, called everyone I could think of, but she's nowhere to be found." Brandon was already on his feet, grabbing his coat. "I'm on my way. Where are you now?" 10 minutes later, Brandon's Aston Martin screeched to a halt outside Margaret's modest home in Queens. The neighborhood was a far cry from the glittering world of Manhattan high-rises and power lunches. Here, small houses with peeling paint stood shoulder to shoulder, their tiny yards more dirt than grass. Margaret was waiting on the porch, wringing her hands. "Oh, Mr. Prescott, thank goodness you're here. I just don't know what to do." Brandon brushed past her, his eyes scanning the street as if Sophie might suddenly materialize. "Tell me everything. Where did you last see her? Where are her usual haunts?" As Margaret babbled about Sophie's favorite park and the corner store where she liked to buy candy, Brandon's mind was racing. A 6-year-old girl, alone in New York City. The possibilities were too horrifying to contemplate. "I'm calling in reinforcements," he said, pulling out his phone. Within minutes, he had his entire security team mobilized, along with a private investigator he kept on retainer for corporate matters. As the search expanded, with men in dark suits combing the neighborhood and questioning locals, Brandon found himself standing in Sophie's tiny bedroom. The walls were painted a soft yellow, decorated with childish drawings and a few faded photographs. His eyes were drawn to one in particular, Claire, smiling radiantly, her arms wrapped around a toddler-aged Sophie. They looked so happy, so complete. A family. The family he should have been a part of. "She was so proud of that picture," Margaret said softly from the doorway. "Said it was from the day they went to the zoo. Sophie talked about it for weeks." Brandon's throat tightened. He'd missed so much. First steps, first words, first day of school. All the milestones that should have been cherished memories were instead gaping holes in his life. "Mr. Prescott?" One of his security team appeared in the doorway. "We may have a lead. A shopkeeper a few blocks over remembers seeing a little girl matching Sophie's description about an hour ago. She was asking for directions to Manhattan." Brandon's heart leapt. "Manhattan? Why would she—" He stopped short as realization dawned. "She's looking for me." Without another word, he was out the door and in his car, speeding towards the city. As he weaved through traffic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, Brandon sent up a silent prayer to a God he'd long since stopped believing in. "Please," he whispered, "please let her be safe. I'll do anything. I'll be better. I'll be the father she deserves. Just, please." As the Manhattan skyline came into view, Brandon's eyes were drawn inexorably to Prescott Tower, its gleaming spire piercing the sky. And there, at the base of the building, was a small figure with golden curls. Sophie. Brandon's car had barely stopped before he was out, running towards her. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and fearful. "Sophie," he said, dropping to his knees in front of her. "Sophie, are you okay? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her lower lip trembling. I wanted to find you. Mom always said you'd come find us when you were ready, but you never did. So I thought maybe I should find you instead." The simple logic of a child, born from years of waiting and disappointment, broke Brandon's heart all over again. He reached out, hesitant, unsure if he had the right to offer comfort after so long. To his surprise, Sophie stepped into his embrace, her small arms wrapping around his neck. And as he held his daughter for the first time, feeling her tears soak into his expensive suit, Brandon Prescott finally understood what it meant to love someone more than himself. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," he whispered, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry. But I'm here now, and I promise I'm not going anywhere ever again." As they sat there on the sidewalk, oblivious to the curious stares of passers-by, Brandon knew his life would never be the same. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, full of challenges he'd never anticipated. But for the first time in years, he felt something he'd thought long lost: hope. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings with social workers, and crash courses in parenting for the utterly clueless. Brandon's penthouse, once a testament to bachelor luxury, was slowly transforming into something resembling a home. Sophie's room, hastily decorated with the help of a team of interior designers working overtime, was an explosion of pink and purple. Stuffed animals crowded every available surface, and a canopy bed fit for a princess dominated the space. Brandon stood in the doorway, watching as Sophie carefully arranged her meager possessions: a few well-worn books, a battered teddy bear, a small box of crayons, amidst the sea of new toys and clothes. "Is it okay?" he asked, hating the uncertainty in his voice. "We can change anything you don't like." Sophie looked up at him, her expression serious. "It's very nice," she said politely. "Thank you." The formality in her tone made Brandon wince. They were still virtual strangers, trying to navigate a relationship neither of them had been prepared for. Every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, both of them afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing. "Listen, Sophie," Brandon said, coming into the room and kneeling down to her level. "I know this is all very strange and scary, and I know I can't just waltz in here and expect to be your dad overnight. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I want to be here for you, to be the father you deserve." Sophie regarded him solemnly, her gray eyes, so like his own, searching his face. "Mom always said you were a good man," she said finally. "She said you were just scared." Brandon's throat tightened. Even after everything, Claire had defended him to their daughter. He didn't deserve such grace. "Your mom was right," he said softly. "I was scared, terrified actually, but that's no excuse for what I did, for leaving you both." Sophie nodded, her little face far too serious for a 6-year-old. "I was mad at you," she admitted, "for not coming to find us, for not being there when Mom got sick." The words were like a knife to Brandon's heart. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. If I had known—" But even as he said it, he knew it was a weak excuse. He should have known. He should have looked for them, should have been there. Sophie seemed to sense his distress. To his surprise, she reached out and patted his hand awkwardly. "It's okay," she said. "Mom said everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." Brandon marveled at the wisdom coming from this tiny person. Claire had done an amazing job raising her, all on her own. The thought filled him with equal parts gratitude and shame. "Your mom was a very smart lady," he said, managing a small smile. "I hope I can be half as wise as she was." Sophie tilted her head, considering this. "Well," she said finally, "you could start by learning how to make pancakes. Mom's pancakes were the best." Brandon laughed, feeling some of the tension ease. "Pancakes, huh? I think I can manage that. Want to help me try?" And so, on a sunny Saturday morning, Brandon Prescott, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, found himself in his seldom-used kitchen, covered in flour and desperately trying to flip a misshapen pancake while his daughter giggled at his efforts. It wasn't perfect. The pancakes were lumpy, the kitchen was a disaster, and there was still an ocean of uncertainty stretching out before them. But as Brandon watched Sophie laugh, her face lighting up in a way he'd never seen before, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Brandon Prescott was truly, completely happy. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, Brandon and Sophie began to find their rhythm. There were missteps along the way, of course. Brandon's first attempt at attending a parent-teacher conference had been a disaster of epic proportions, ending with him nearly buying the entire school just to fire a teacher who had dared to suggest Sophie was a bit behind in math. But there were triumphs too. The first time Sophie called him Dad instead of Mr. Brandon had brought tears to his eyes. The day he successfully navigated the complex social politics of a 6-year-old's birthday party felt like a greater achievement than any business deal he'd ever closed. Yet even as they grew closer, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Sophie was happy, yes, but there was a sadness in her eyes sometimes, a longing that he couldn't quite reach. It all came to a head one night, about 6 months after Sophie had come to live with him. Brandon was tucking her into bed, a nightly ritual that had become his favorite part of the day. "Dad?" Sophie said, her voice small in the darkness of her room. "Yes, sweetheart?" Do you think Mom can see us? From heaven?" Brandon's breath caught in his throat. They rarely spoke about Claire, the loss still too raw for both of them, but he knew Sophie needed this, needed to keep her mother's memory alive. "I'm sure she can," he said softly, smoothing Sophie's curls back from her forehead. "And I bet she's so proud of you." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I miss her." The simple admission broke Brandon's heart. He gathered Sophie into his arms, feeling her small body shake with silent sobs. "I miss her too, sweetheart," he said, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I miss her so much." As he held his daughter, Brandon was struck by a sudden, overwhelming realization. He'd been so focused on being a good father, on making up for lost time, that he neglected a crucial part of Sophie's healing, and his own. They needed to talk about Claire, to remember her, to celebrate her, to mourn her properly. Brandon had been avoiding it, too caught up in his own guilt and regret. But Sophie needed this. They both did. The next morning, Brandon called Patricia and cleared his schedule for the day. Then he woke Sophie up early, much to her sleepy confusion. "Come on, Munchkin," he said, tossing her a sweatshirt. "We're going on an adventure." An hour later, they were strolling through the Central Park Zoo, hand in hand. Brandon watched as Sophie's eyes lit up at the sight of the penguins waddling about their enclosure. "Your mom brought you here once," he said softly, "when you were just a little thing. There's a picture." Sophie nodded eagerly. "I remember. It's my favorite picture. Mom said it was the best day ever." By the time they reached the elephant enclosure, Sophie's favorite, Brandon had made a decision. He led Sophie to a nearby bench and sat down, pulling her into his lap. "Sophie," he said seriously, "I want to tell you about the day I met your mom." And so, as the afternoon sun warmed their faces and the sounds of the zoo swirled around them, Brandon opened up about Claire in a way he never had before. He told Sophie about their whirlwind romance, about Claire's infectious laugh and her unwavering kindness. He talked about her dreams of becoming an artist and how she'd light up when talking about her latest project. "Your mom," Brandon said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the most amazing person I've ever known, and I was an idiot for ever letting her go." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide and shining. "But you found me," she said. "Mom always said you would, when you were ready." Brandon hugged her tightly, marveling at the faith Claire had maintained in him, even after everything. "Your mom was right about a lot of things," he said. "I just wish I'd realized it sooner." As they left the zoo that evening, Sophie's small hand clasped firmly in his, Brandon felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like they were truly on the right path. That night, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she asked for a story about her mom. And as Brandon recounted one of Claire's famous misadventures in the kitchen, Sophie's laughter ringing out in the darkened room, he sent up a silent thank you to the woman who had given him this precious gift. "I'll make you proud, Claire," he whispered after Sophie had drifted off to sleep. "I promise." And somewhere, somehow, Brandon could almost swear he heard Claire's voice, soft and warm as he remembered it. "You already have, my love. You already have."
All right, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick? Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my second year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, "I'm thirsty." Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. "I don't care what they say, I plan to quit any time," he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look, "To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day." Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. "So, you all get a chance." As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. "Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them." It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. "All right, everyone's presentations are done." "Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something." Nick interrupted me. "There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer." He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. "Still here?" Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. "I'm leaving." I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick? What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was, as the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their inn. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong. Mike. What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that? Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here." "He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part." I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.